So my name is Jason Burns. I'm on the connectivity team at Tableau. I'm a product manager. I'm here with John Q, who also is on the enterprise connectivity team. And we want to talk to you guys about Kerberos. We have, I think, an interesting way to present this that John's put together. So I want to pretext this a little bit with just some general security information. And then we'll do a little exercise. We'll go through some diagrams. I'm kidding. We're actually not going to go through diagrams. That's kind of the point of this. Well, there's some diagrams, but we're not going through a diagram is the point I'm making. We're not going to make you stare at one. So let's go ahead and get started. A little bit about me. I've been at Tableau since 2013. I've been working in connectivity the whole time. Before that, I was at Microsoft, super into photography, and I guess I reordered these. So let me do the first. I just want a little bit about myself. I'm into photography. I'm into guitars, and I kind of have a little analogy that that's important too that I'll get to in a minute. But I've been, again, in Tableau since 2013, focused on connectivity. I was at Microsoft before that. Why is this one ahead of me? It's going one ahead of everything I do. Okay. So the real reason I'm here is to be a hype man for John, who has the meat of this presentation. And I added some really interesting information to hype him up. He actually didn't give me information, so I left some really interesting bullets. So hopefully he'll get you a little more information about himself. But let's kind of get into this. So everyone dreams of having single sign-on solutions, right? We talk to customers every day that use lots of different types of data sources, and they struggle with all kinds of reasons that customers can't actually get to data because of passwords passing through different systems, things like that. The other flip side of this, though, is they're willing to use just about anything but Kerberos to do it. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, and some of it is kind of some myth and FUD. I think we can kind of dispel a little bit today. But there is complexity there, and I think it's very difficult to look at a diagram, especially when you're looking at something that's crossing multiple domains, and understand the flow and understand how Kerberos actually works. So what we want to do today is kind of dig beneath that and kind of overlay a natural language conversation and give you an idea how this actually works. So let's go through a little bit of pretext with security first, because I want to paint a larger picture of Tableau's security options and kind of how Kerberos fits in that. So if you go to Tableau's data security page, it looks like this, and it lists a bunch of things that we call security. There are a few of these that I take off the bat. Server settings is just a group of settings that configure how data sources kind of operate. It's not really a security solution for data. And also SQL Server impersonation, while this is a heavily used thing, it's very specific to SQL Server, so not really useful today. So let's look at what we have left. User filters and data source filters. It's okay, it's okay. Run as user, OAuth connections, and Kerberos delegation. So I want to talk about a few of these in a little more detail, because when we talk to customers who are specifically looking for enterprise class security solutions, this kind of thing comes up a lot as an alternative to Kerberos or alternative to SAML and things like that. And it's definitely a valid solution, especially in a more tactical solution where you kind of need to obscure data, but it's not really a security solution in the sense that all the data still comes over the wire. It's if it's not SSL, it's readable. So there's risk there. Run as user gets us a little closer to where we would want to be. You can actually use Kerberos, but if you notice, I say which user I am, and in a single sign-on solution, I need to know what user I want you to be at the time that you're accessing the data. So that's not really an SSO solution for us. OAuth gets us really close to where we want to be, but it's a little more of an internet-based technology, so a lot of the on-premise databases don't support it yet. That's changing, but it's still kind of true today. I mentioned SAML as well. We do support SAML in a HANA scenario today. Very similar technology, but we actually don't support SAML in a generic way today in Tableau Server. It's something that we're going to bring, but right now it's specific to HANA. And so why Kerberos? There's several scenarios I think Kerberos makes really interesting. The first one is two-factor authentication. In a lot of our cases, especially before we came to this session, we were talking to a bunch of SAP users. And in cases where you use an RSA key, or you use a smart card to authenticate, those type of things. A lot of users don't actually know their passwords. So two-factor auth is a scenario Kerberos is really great for because it doesn't actually need your password. It just needs the domain controller to validate that you are who it thinks you are. The second one is trust. And as a lot of companies grow and acquire other companies, they don't always merge all their users into a single user system. They might have users in a geographic, another country entirely that's on its own domain, and they set up trust. So I say, well, any user in this directory I implicitly trust. These scenarios aren't all completely unique to Kerberos, but Kerberos is really the most common technology that's used for these types of things. This one, the ugliest dialog box in Windows. This isn't a Tableau dialog box. Constrained delegation is one of the main reasons that we come across Kerberos. So when we talk to a customer that wants to sign into Windows, open up Tableau, connect to their data, publish a viz, and then John comes in and he looks at that viz and it's John. To accomplish that today with Kerberos, we have to use constrained delegation. So I want to do one asterisk before I get to this next section because I'm really selling Kerberos really hard, but there are a few things that we should mention. I say it's not a Tesla, and by that what I mean is it's not the most modern technology. It's not really meant to work on the internet, honestly. There are people that use it that way through VPNs and things, but OAuth and SAML are definitely much more modern implementations of SSO. The second one, it's definitely not do-it-yourself. In certain cases, if it's already configured in your environment, absolutely, you can just use integrated authentication, and Tableau's just going to rock and roll. But if it's not, then you're probably going to need a domain administrator. You might have to reconfigure users in Active Directory. You might have to set up trusts if you need them, those kind of things. So it's not something an end user is usually going to be able to tackle. And finally, it's not a Swiss Army knife. There are a lot of situations when you get into these crazy multi-domain type configurations using things like resource-based constrained delegation that you just can't get there from here. The model enforces that you can't do a man-in-the-middle attack, for example, and those strategies to enforce those things just make some scenarios absolutely impossible. Okay, so the analogy, back to the music thing. I produce a lot of music, and when I was thinking about the Kerberos diagrams and you see just lines everywhere and dots everywhere, it reminded me of a mixing board. And when I first saw one of these things, I was just incredibly intimidated because how would you know what all these things do? And then you flip it over, and now you have all these connections to deal with, and you just don't understand. So I think there's an interesting analogy in there. If you look at this diagram, for example, if you know Kerberos, that might make sense to you. If you look at this one, a little simpler, but it doesn't look remotely like the other one. Another interpretation, and my favorite was this one. Like, what does this mean? Like, that person is equal to another person. I'm assuming that means delegation, but I'm not sure. So if we look back at our mixing board, same thing, but look at this. There's a pattern. Every one of these is exactly the same. As we start going through the Kerberos stuff that John's going to show you, you'll see that the tickets are relatively the same. The information inside them might change. The messages and the patterns that they ask and request for information are the same. So instead of looking at those diagrams as a big piece, just look at every little hop or every little communication. And that's what John's going to go through right now.
All righty. So, So yeah, as Jason said, it's kind of hard to talk about Kerberos in one way because not everybody kind of interprets it in the same way. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to talk about Kerberos in 4 different ways concurrently. And we think that'll make it easier to understand. But we'll have a natural language discussion. We'll go over actual Wireshark traces. We'll go over a little bit of code. And we'll even see one diagram. But first, I want to introduce a new database from a stealth startup within Tableau. It's called Bagel DB. And this is what it does. So Bagel DB, it's a new database within Tableau, and it is a system for the organization, storage, and retrieval of Bagel information. It is actually a single user database, but it actually does implement Kerberos. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to walk through the Kerberos implementation to this actual database. To To give you an idea of what Bagel DB does, you can start it up from the command line. It says loading, loading, loading. It actually put a 1 second delay after each loading message because that makes it more enterprisey. And then down here, you go ahead, you can telnet in, and it'll ask you questions about what sort of bagel you have. Does it have salt on it? No. Is the bagel full of dark humor laced with puns? No. Do people who eat these bagels have deep conversations and detest corporate greed? No. Is it sugary? Does it have caramel? Does it have chocolate chips? I guess you have a cinnamon raisin bagel. Is this correct? Yes. So that's what it does. It's a fantastic database. Everyone should be using it. And this is actually the global open source release of this database. You can go onto GitHub and get this working in your enterprise environment. But the big thing about it is that, people weren't really using this database. So we thought, let's make it more enterprise worthy. So we thought bagels plus Kerberos equals enterprise. So that's what we built on top of Bagel DB. And you'll see the client side and the database side of this sort of work. So in order to talk about this, first we're going to talk about the basic Kerberos exchange, which is single hop Kerberos. You're logging in your desktop and then you're connecting to some database. In order to do this, I'm going to need a couple of volunteers because we're going to have do a little play here. I'll be the narrator. It's not scary. It's not a lot of lines, but it is some lines. It is scary, but you have the opportunity of winning one of these fancy T-shirts, and if anything could attract volunteers, it's T-shirts. So we need, Jason Burns will play Alice, the Bagel database. I need Microsoft Bob, the Active Directory server. So do I have a volunteer for, okay, do you want to come on up here or stand near Jason? And then we have Eve, the Bagel database client. Is there anyone? Okay, come on up. All right. I think he'll just pass around the microphone. Go ahead and stand near here because I think he's actually going to.
Yeah, I'll just go back and forth.
All right. So I'll set the scene. Narrator. A bagel shop. Alice, the Bagel database, is happily responding to requests from customers about all the different types of bagels. But Alice doesn't just trust anyone. So Microsoft Bob, do you want to read the lines in blue here?
Sure.
Hopefully you can see.
You have your service key, right? Without it, I can't vouch for anyone waiting to access your Bagel database.
So yeah, totally. My domain administrator set me up for Kerberos authentication. I'll trust all the people you trust.
Eve walks into the bagel shop. So before the exchange, the actual protocol starts, there's some setup. The domain administrator has done a little bit of work. There's some trust that has been established between the different parties. The client, Eve, who just walked into the bagel shop, knows her password, hopefully. And often it's stored in a file called a key tab. The database service, Alice, knows her password, often in a key tab. And the Active Directory, or also called the KDC, the Key Distribution Center, knows everything. And they store most of their information in an LDAP database. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to start the wire exchange. So, Eve, you want to start us off on this first green line here?
Okay. Hey, Bob, you know me, right? Here's my username.
So the first packet that goes out when you're dealing with Kerberos is to a part of the Active Directory server called the authentication service. And really, this is just logging into the Active Directory server. And this, if you're not familiar with this is Wireshark here. And occasionally, maybe you do have some familiarity, but this allows you to analyze network packets. If you download Wireshark and up in the filters, you sort of type Kerberos, you can actually see this exchange for yourself on, on your own servers. So what we're doing here is this AS request means that we're making a request to the authentication service. We've got this is the client machine talking to the Active Directory. And in it, and this is a little mistake, this is my username. Pretend that's Eve. But you have Eve's username and the domain that she is a part of. She's saying, hey, this is me. Am I a real user? And Active Directory responds with,
Let me walk back.
Yeah. Yeah, the username is right. Here is a secret message containing a special character
decoder ring.
ring that only you can use. We will use that as our shared decoder, right, for future messages. Keep that around at least for 24 hours. That little key is a good as may word, but if you are who you say you are, only you should be able to read this.
Do you guys want to move a little over here so you don't have to
Yeah,
lean
let's do that.
so much? So the response comes back from the authentication service, and it includes a little bit of other information. It says, yes, you are a valid user, and we're going to give you essentially the shared key for the session key for the duration of the exchange. And this allows, so only Eve in this case can really use this key. She can decode it using her password, and then she has that shared key, and then she can use it from that point onward. And that session key, that little decoder ring, is only valid for a certain duration. So there's a limit to its validity. After that point, it's no longer valid. If somebody steals it, eventually it's not a big deal. So let's go on. This is what it looks like if you're spending a lot of time in Visio. This is how you would sort of draw it out. You've got the local machine making a plain text request saying, hey, I'm user so-and-so to the KDC or Active Directory. And the KDC comes back with what's called a ticket granting ticket along with the decoder ring, which goes back to the client machine. And this is, you don't have to pay attention to all of this, but this is kind of what it looks like in code. Most code kind of has a similar sort of API. And the key thing here is that up at the top, we specify, yes, we're using Kerberos here. This is just a Java security JASS file. And then there's sort of this stage where you pass into some, you do log in with the username and password, and you do log in. And that's about it. It's pretty simple exchange to the authentication service. You need a username, you need a password, and you need to know that you are going to be going through the authentication service of Active Directory. And this is also what it looks like. So when you log into your computer, if you're using Windows or if you have it set up, OS X, the first thing that happens, you'll go ahead and make a request to the authentication service and get your secret decoder ring or your TGT back. So this happens automatically if you're joined to a domain. But there's more. With that sort of thing, you can't really do much. You need to actually talk to a database. You want to talk to other services. And this is where we get into the service ticket phase of this exchange. So Eve, you want to start reading this?
Thanks, Bob. I was thinking of starting a transaction with Alice the Bagel database. Do you think you could give me a service ticket which I can use to start a transaction? Here's that request encrypted with our cool little decoder ring.
So she makes a request, and she says, "Hey, I want to go ahead and I want to get the service ticket for Bagel DB, associated with my username." So, we're talking to a different part of Active Directory in this case, the ticket granting service, and that will go ahead and essentially pass back what's called the service ticket, which then you can use in future exchanges with that database.
Hey, sure thing, but this ticket is encrypted with Alice's secret decoder ring. She's the only who can read it. Now leave me alone. It's Patch Tuesday and I need some TLC.
So a couple of key things here. The ticket is coming back with Alice's, the database's secret key. So Eve cannot completely read this information. This is an important part. So what we're doing is we're passing back this service ticket, And it's encrypted in such a way that only the end database is able to verify its contents. This is important for, if you lose a service ticket, it's sort of another layer of trust on top of that. And this is what it looks like in sort of the Visio form. You pass in your original ticket granting ticket along with the service request, and you get back this service ticket along with that message. And this is what it looks like. Now this is going to get a little bit more interesting because there's an exchange that then occurs with Active Directory from the client side. And this is actually why the client side of getting a service ticket is actually important. This is why some drivers don't necessarily support Kerberos entirely. There's actually some work that has to be done on the client side to make sure that that security context is initialized. You go ahead and there's two functions, one that lives on the server, but the main thing is you set up this context. You say, okay, I want to create this, this request for this particular server name. You go ahead and select, in this case, credential delegation. You go ahead and then you initialize the security context here, and this will actually make the call to Active Directory. And you know what? This is a little off. Oh, did you? Okay. All right. Well, so then we have our service ticket. We've got something that basically says Eve can talk to the Bagel database. What do we do with it? We need to pass that off to the database. The database needs to verify that. So we go ahead and connect. And then this is not using a Kerberos protocol. This is not like a Wireshark protocol. It can go over any sort of thing. It could go over Pigeon or whatever. But when we first connect to the Bagel database, the first thing it prints out is Kerberos ticket, : and that's it. That's just something I made up. It could be anything. It could be fuzzy bear. But the point is that then the client knows, oh, okay, this is the time when I'm going to pass my service ticket. And so, Eve, do you want to go ahead and...
Sure. Hello, Bagel database.
I don't talk to anyone about bagels unless they have a Kerberos ticket.
And then we go ahead and Eve says,
Here's my Kerberos ticket that I got from our friend Bob. I encoded it in base 64 because I know that's how you like it.
So again, like the encoding, how it's transmitted, that service ticket, doesn't actually matter as long as that on the server side, the raw bytes can be extracted and used by that database to verify the identity. And you'll see kind of how it does that in a second. And Alice?
Inspecting and decoding the service ticket. Good news, you are not an intruder.
And so what it looks like, it's not particularly exciting. You are, in this case, this is Tableau Server in this case. It's passing a service ticket over to the database server, and that's about it. Basically coming back and saying, yes, you are valid. And this is what it looks like from the server side. So I mentioned you have this initialized context on the client side. You have an accept context on the other side. And those two functions, they work together and they exchange messages back and forth over whatever protocol you happen to have. So on the accept context side, we decode the ticket to get the raw bytes. And then we go ahead and we pass it into this accept context function, which then goes ahead, it decrypts it using Alice's, the database's secret key, and validates that, yes, Eve is who she says she is. And if you get a response back that says, hey, GSS complete, you go ahead and say, yep, you are valid. So this is sort of like the simple Kerberos exchange. Key things, we've got a session key. Oops, hold on. We've got a session key, that secret decoder ring, which was established at the beginning of the exchange. That is a session key between the Eve and the authentication service or Active Directory. We get a ticket granting ticket, which we get back from Active Directory, which allows us to make subsequent requests to the ticket granting service within Active Directory. And now we get into constrained delegation with protocol transition. And I promise this won't be painful as long as kind of you're, you kind of followed along a little bit on the smaller exchange. And you don't have to follow everything, I don't expect that, but just sort of the basics are really important here. So constrained delegation with protocol transition, that's the way Tableau Server communicates with Kerberos to other databases when we're doing SSO.
Delegation specifically.
Delegation specifically, yeah. So Eve, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So here's the problem, Bob. I can talk to Alice, no problem, but my friend Fred is allergic to garlic and cannot set foot inside that bagel shop. Is there any way for me to ask Alice some questions, but make her think she's talking to Fred?
Hey, sure, this is called Kerberos, constrained delegation. You probably also want protocol transition because Fred cannot just forward these credentials into the bagel shop. You need to file a service ticket with my domain administration to set this up.
So this is the most exciting, yeah, this is the best bagel shop ever. But the couple of key things, Jason mentioned this earlier, most confusing dialogue. This is sort of what each little piece means. For constrained delegation, getting that little trust this user for delegation to specified services only, that's sort of the step. That's what puts it into a constrained delegation phase. And what it does is it allows Active Directory to say that, okay, this user can impersonate other users, but only to these specified services. There's sort of a hard restriction on what services are accessible through this method. And then the other thing is protocol transition. Use any authentication protocol. Now this probably confuses people enormously. If you click on use any authentication protocol, what does that mean? Does that mean we're not using Kerberos anymore? This is used in cases where, Tableau Server, you're logging into Tableau Server using SAML or OAuth or something like that, but the underlying data source doesn't support that. And there's a lot of cases like that where different database services support different authentication protocols than what Tableau Server supports. So the reason why we do protocol transition is in order to make that hop, essentially, from one authentication method, and then down where we're actually making the connection, we can choose the authentication method that is most appropriate for that database. And this is what it looks like. So Eve, you want to?
Sure. Hey, Bob. Can I get a service ticket for myself for Fred? I need to be able to make requests for other services, as if I were Fred.
Okay. Now we're getting into what's called the service for user to self call. This is a little bit confusing. Eve, in this case, the user, is getting a service ticket to herself. That makes no sense. I mean, in the last exchange, we got a service ticket to a database. Right? Why would we want to get a service ticket to ourselves? The reason why we do this is so that essentially we put ourselves so that we can make subsequent requests to the ticket granting service using that service ticket. There's sort of this split there between, the ticket granting service takes these service tickets, and it's the one that can actually perform this constrained delegation. But in order to get to that point, you have to sort of convert your TGT into a TGS, a service ticket. There's a couple of interesting things here. When you look at it in Wireshark, you have this pre-authentication data section. So this is the PA data section. This is used for a lot of things within the Kerberos protocol, including a lot of extensions. If you look at this exchange in Microsoft Windows, you'll see group information coming back for just an exchange to the authentication service. You'll see a lot of information sort of jammed into this part of the packet. But you'll also see, sort of extensions like S for you to self, and where we are making these sort of specialized requests. And this is how the TGS actually knows to do this sort of operation. Bob, you want to respond?
This is call and service for user to self, S4U to self call. Yep, here you go.
Okay. And it comes back, and it's just like a normal service ticket, but it's to Eve the service. And then there's yet another exchange that occurs with the ticket granting service.
Okay, thanks. Okay, now that I can make requests using this service ticket, can I have a service ticket for Alice on behalf of Fred?
And
Sure, this is a service for user to proxy, S4U to proxy call. Yep. Here you go.
okay, so here we go. If you go back one step, the request, this is where we're actually, although I don't have it here, it's somewhere in here. Oh yeah. No, I don't have it here. Within here, we actually have the request that says, this is who I want to impersonate, and I want to impersonate this person to this service. And the response that comes back is a service ticket, which is actually very similar to the one that you would get if you were just going from desktop to the database directly. And in fact, the database doesn't care in this case. It is actually a service ticket that looks like it is Fred's service ticket to Alice the database. And it comes back, this is, again, well, this is a little bit the CNAME. I think I could have expanded some of that stuff. But when you connect to Bagel DB, this is what it looks like. Actually, I should have changed that. It should have said Fred there in this case, but it'll say Fred. Basically, it'll impersonate that particular user. Eve, you want to go ahead and...
Cool. Now I can talk to Alice normally, and Alice will think I'm Fred.
Yeah, and that's about it. The impersonation code on the client side is a little bit different. Within Java, it's actually pretty easy. You have to set up, sort of the user you want to impersonate in this case, and then you really call this .impersonate call, and that sort of wraps the S4U to self call. And then you make the subsequent request for the service ticket normally. But that .impersonate, at least within Java, is that first S4U to self call. So sort of a review of this. Constrained delegation is the ability to delegate communication to a service to an intermediate entity. So we are saying that Eve, in this case, has special privileges to impersonate, to delegate communication, or has special privileges to impersonate another user to that particular service. Protocol transition, covered this a little bit before, but ability to initiate the impersonation of a user without the original password, without passing a Kerberos ticket all the way down through the whole track. You can switch from sort of SAML when you're logging into Tableau Server over to Kerberos. And the service ticket contains the session key for communication between the client and the service. It can only be decrypted by Alice. So let's thank our actors. You get a T-shirt. I think they're all sorts of different sizes. Okay, that might be a not extra large one there on the front on the podium. So let's go ahead and any questions about this? Was this even helpful? Was this the right way to explain it? Oh yeah? Okay. All right. It's sort of challenging. We've tried this once before, and we did kind of a similar play thing, but it was kind of confusing. I felt like kind of layering multiple explanations was a little bit better, but I don't know if any questions about this? Anyone having issues with Kerberos or doing the diagnostic?
We're trying to connect Kerberos to Hadoop.
Okay.
And we've tried it now for 2 or 3 weeks now.
Yeah.
And it seems like the Tableau side is working fine, but then when it gets to Hadoop,
Yeah.
it's not working.
Yeah.
And we are using a service account in order to connect to Hadoop, and then we want to impersonate whoever is using it. So do you guys have
We have problems like that all the time. And I mean, you know, and I think the thing is that from Hadoop, and first of all, which component of Hadoop? Which,
Well,
you know, are okay.
no, actually, I don't know. I know we are currently working with Horton.
Okay, Hortonworks.
Yeah, Horton.
So, I mean, the thing to first check is, because again, in both of these protocols, for both the delegation and the single, you know, hop use case, to the database, it doesn't matter. There's no code change, nothing. But what the database does need is it needs that shared key, or it needs to have its password essentially inside of a key tab, which is from Active Directory or the MIT KDC. So my suspicion there is that, you know, I would test just the Tableau desktop directly first, get that working, and then build up from there.
Yeah, I mean, let's see. If they connect to the desktop, it seems to be working fine.
So then that indicates probably one of the problems with delegation. And that probably means either, well, it could mean a number of things. It could mean that the run as user isn't the same one that's requesting that initial ticket, doing the S for you to self call that we described earlier. It could mean that the service principals are not correctly set up in that dialog, or even, and this is kind of a common problem, like you have multiple service principals that are duplicated. You know, Active Directory is taking in these service principals. I'll show you in a second here. The service principal looks, you know, well, kind of a bad example. Let's see if I can, yeah, it sort of looks like, yeah, looks like this, although it also has sort of a domain part. You know, the service principal in these cases, you know, what it's doing is it's essentially looking up those users, those identities within LDAP, using that service principal. And what we see a lot is that, you know, in certain configurations, that service principal is just slightly different. Or, you know, maybe it includes the full domain, or it's a truncated domain, or there's something different about that. And so one thing that you got to look for, and this is why kind of I like doing the Wireshark thing, is because as a diagnostic tool, you can go in and you can look at this and you can say, okay, you know, this user I know is part of this domain, and the service principal looks like this. And then you can go to Active Directory and compare it to kind of what is registered there, and you can kind of trace through these lines. And it seems strange to recommend Wireshark as like, you know, hey, it's the best way. But what I see is it's sort of the source of truth. You know, it's what's actually occurring. And forget all the configuration, forget all the complexity of different configuration files and things like that. One thing that is sort of standard is at least that initial protocol that occurs with Kerberos. And when you look at it through Wireshark, there's conventional ways that you should see the pattern if you look through things carefully.
When we get to complex scenarios, I'll often ask the customer to send us a trace of
Well, we have already, we have Tableau with, you know, we had Tableau on one side and Hortonworks on the other side. We were in the middle, and we've figured out that it's not the Tableau side. Tableau is doing everything correctly.
Huh.
But Hortonworks is asking for logs, so we had to send them the logs from the desktop, the logs from the servers. You know,
Yeah.
And they're not trying to figure out, they can't figure it out. I mean, we don't know what it is they're doing on their side. They can't figure it out.
So, I mean, that sounds like we probably want to talk to like an engineer from Hortonworks and just kind of work together on that.
Yeah, that's what they're trying to do.
Is Tableau Server already involved as well?
Yeah.
After this is
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like I said, we came to the conclusion that it's nothing in Tableau side. I mean, Tableau is sending whatever packages are read it the correct way once it gets to Hadoop.
Yeah.
That's the one thing that we have to explain a lot of times to people, especially when you get to the constrained delegation piece. Tableau is part of the conversation is very minimal. At the point that we tell the driver, okay, you need to do this and here's what you need, it's really that driver will get the ticket, it will pass it, all that stuff, so we get to a point where that kind of becomes a wall.
Yeah, well, I think what the Hortonworks people are saying that it's not them, that it's whoever wrote the driver that they need to talk to.
And then that's, I don't know. Yeah. There's a handful of database driver companies that we work pretty closely with, so like we can also talk to them indirectly and yeah. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Well, we're more confused in Kerberos issues as well. So we have three requirements of prod, non-prod, and a sandbox. Prod and non-prod were set up with Kerberos years ago. The sandbox wasn't. But we're at a crazy low version, and we're trying to POC. Well, after we upgrade, we're trying to POC the Kerberos connection to Teradata in sandbox. We have to set up Kerberos initially first. We run into a lot of issues, and the latest issue that we have right now is that the key tab file won't take in the configuration utility. It bombs and it says that the key tab file already exists. Essentially, it can't copy it out from the primary to the workers.
Okay.
And we've been working with support for a number of weeks now on different issues, but this is the last piece of it, I believe. Any ideas or thoughts as to why key tab wouldn't take?
When you said really old version of what?
We're at 9.0 for Tableau. We're gonna go
I don't
to
think
10.2.
we supported Teradata.
No, we're going to 10.2.
Oh, okay.
Then we're gonna do, but that the sequence of things is upgrade sandbox to 10.2, then do the
Right.
stuff with the Kerberos to Teradata.
And
Tableau Server that's not accepting your key tab.
The Tableau configuration utility, yes.
interesting.
Yeah, I heard that one.
So there's so actually, I think what's happening is when you go through the configuration utility, that key tab is actually for Kerberos to Tableau Server, the front end, not Kerberos to the database server, and it's just having a problem copying the files. There's other.
We can't get Kerberos set up in general, much less
Yeah.
Teradata.
Okay, so yeah, definitely setting up Kerberos in general. There's a few people, I don't know of any particular issues with distribution, but we know a lot of the people who work on that. And there's another talk where actually we can put you in contact with the right people who work on those components and can give you kind of a little better answer. Yeah, and we can message the person and maybe see if we can get them over. Any other questions? I want to make sure to highlight, so there's a couple other things. There's well, this actually already happened, I guess, and this is happening. So sorry. But they're great.
We're not gonna have another one about low-level security.
Maybe there is another one. I don't know. Are there two? Okay. Oh, you're right. I keep on thinking it's. All right. Okay. No. All right. I keep on thinking that it's Thursday today, but I'm off by one. Anyways, yeah. So these are a couple of different sessions which might be worth connecting to. Row level security is going to be a lot more broader. It's going to talk about user filters and some of the other things. And then connecting to data sources for Tableau Server on Linux. This is another talk which goes into a little bit more detail on Kerberos on Linux. It's actually easier in a lot of ways to do Kerberos on Linux than it is on Windows because you have full control over the key tabs and some of the caches that are used to store Kerberos tickets. But the other thing I want to highlight is a survey because we're with a connectivity team and we need your input. You know, we want to understand what data sources you're connecting to, you know, what types of authentication protocols, any sort of issues you're having. We're going to take a lot of this feedback, and basically this will help us prioritize our backlog.
When I was talking at the beginning about being too, and John referenced it too, I need to go in and off Kerberos, this kind of thing. We're finding that becoming more and more common scenarios for our customers. So what we're trying to do is kind of build out what that matrix is and have an environment where we can, mock some of these things and help test them when you're trying. So letting us know what you're trying to use and what we want to use will help us with that stuff.
All right.
I think the deck and reporting and all that is going to be online.
All right. That's it. All right. Take care.